Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Clifford Shannon, and on behalf of the 9/11 Memorial Museum, I want to welcome you to today's program. It is 20 years that, of course, we know in September will mark that anniversary commemoration of the destruction of the World Trade Center. But today's program is also about a destructive act of 20 years ago in March 2001, when the Taliban government destroyed these two iconic Buddha sculpture statues that for 1,500 years had been a symbol of Afghanistan's history and Afghanistan's diversity and presence in the world. And so today we're going to talk about the significance, not just of the destruction of this cultural icon, which of course was significant in itself, but what it meant about what was happening in Afghanistan and what the Taliban's rule in that country meant and what it would come to mean for 9/11 and now 20 years later with US forces still in Afghanistan. I'm very, very pleased to have the opportunity to welcome our guest. Murwari Zafar is adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University. She's the founder and managing director of the Sentient Group, which is a human sciences consultancy based in Washington, D.C. She has extensive experience in cultural advising in Afghanistan and that part of the world for aid agencies. She's worked for aid agencies on the ground there. She was born in Afghanistan, left that country with her family when she was 8.5 and came to the US to move to California when she was 13. And so, Murwari, welcome, and thank you very much for taking the time and joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'm just going to give a couple of housekeeping notes. If you click on the link at the bottom, you will find live captioning. And if you're interested in submitting a question during the course of the program, please do so. Use the chat bubble and it will be communicated onward to me. So Murwari, let's come to those Bamiyan Buddhas themselves. Two enormous sculptures, the tallest of them 175 feet, carved into the mountains of Afghanistan. Tell me a bit of their history and, in more contemporary times, what they had come to represent, why they posed such a threat in the eyes of the Taliban that they had to be destroyed.
Sure. So it's important to keep in mind a couple of things that, when you look at Afghanistan's history, one of the things that it has become subject to in more recent discourse is that it's almost as if Afghanistan's history started at the Soviet invasion. But if you look well beyond that, it has had this really rich history with various cultural and religious influences that have created, the fabric of Afghan society and culture. Now, the Buddhas themselves, where they're situated, so they're in Bamiyan Valley. So if you think of Afghanistan as part of the Silk Road, as in the middle of the Silk Road, Bamiyan Valley is really in the heart of the Silk Road. So these Buddhas were created really to as the foundation of Buddhism in Afghanistan in the 6th and 7th century. And it was a place that, a lot of merchants and travelers and monks would travel to on their route through the Silk Road. So it really it resonated with that both in the 6th and 7th century, but also thereafter with the cultural and historical significance of the Silk Road itself. And then moving forward in more contemporary dialogues, we look at the Bamiyan Valley as a place that was a testament to Afghanistan's cultural diversity. Now, the erasure of that has happened more recently with the Taliban is really a testament to the more political influences that overtook that region, far less to do with the lack of cultural tolerance for different ideas. So this was a very politically motivated act to reshape Afghanistan's national identity.
Let me ask if we can pull up slide number 3, because that gives a sense of what that valley looks like. And so you can see on your screens those two alcoves on the left and the right of that mountain, which is where the Buddhas were carved in. And so it's really quite an extraordinary enterprise 1,500 years ago to have undertaken, this kind of construction project. Now, I assume this is pre-Islamic times, so of course there would not have been Islam in that period. But when the local people converted to Islam, which is, I believe, the 12th century, the Bamiyan Buddhas were safe under that kind of rule. They were not considered a threat, nor were they targeted. Is that right?
No, that's correct. And they hadn't been targeted for decades after. The irony is that their erasure was supposed to be, or their destruction was supposed to be done in consistent with more orthodox beliefs of Islam, but in reality, when you think that the Buddhas were around in the 7th century after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, and the excursion of the Islamic dynasties around the world to spread Islam, ultimately bringing them into Afghanistan. But for many, for centuries, they stood guard over the Bamiyan Valley as a testament to Afghanistan's cultural and religious diversity. I mean, no less you would find, a lot of these Buddhas, both in the Bamiyan Valley and in other parts of Afghanistan, that are an amalgam of both Buddhist influences and then Hellenistic influences from the Greco-Roman period. So that in and of itself shows that there was a lot of influences that were not only tolerated, but sort of reproduced in the art of that region.
One of the interesting things, and we can show slide 2, which will give you now a photograph of one of those Buddhas. The Silk Road, and perhaps people need a little bit of a background on the Silk Road, but it was the main trading route through Asia. And so you had great diversity of peoples, moving around all of these areas, and a kind of interaction that was premised on the idea that they needed one another, whether to trade or to live with or whatever it was. That difference was not automatically a marker of hostility. So when we see the Buddhas here, what role did they play as kind of cultural icon in the Afghan context? They were obviously located in a place, but as I've come to understand, they were also a national symbol. They were on stamps, they were on advertisements, they were on various things that were considered Afghan as a national representation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, like I said, these places were a testament to Afghanistan's history. Back when, the sense of Afghan nationalism was the fact that this country was so culturally enriched. And that's what mattered, was that it had this long history, this legacy in Afghan society. Whereas now, when the Afghan sense of nationalism has really started to wrap itself around the axle of Islam, and particularly, an Islam that's defined by the Taliban or by Al-Qaeda, that sense of identity no longer mirrors what the Buddhas used to once represent. And that's where I think, a lot of the more problematic issues around Afghan identity and Afghan nationalism start to emerge.
So let's go to slide 4, because there we'll juxtapose the standing Buddha with the emptied shell where the Buddha had stood. And I think it's important to say that the Buddhas themselves are actually part of an entire complex of caverns and worship sites and all of these places within the mountain that were places of pilgrimage or places of religious respite for travelers or for believers on the way. But I mean, the difference here is obviously terrible, but extraordinarily dramatic, that there is emptiness where this once magnificent sculpture stood.
Absolutely. And, to your point, one of the things, these places being a respite for travelers, for pilgrims that were coming in. I mean, one of the early descriptions of these Buddhas came from a monk from China who had traveled and talked about these beautifully colored and gilded structures that he found in the valley. That's how we know what these places looked like. Is that back then, this is when, at least when I think of the Buddhas of Bamiyan and what they represented, it was a culture of tolerance that ironically doesn't seem to parallel what we would see in, say, the 21st century in Afghanistan. And that culture was further exemplified by the fact that when you look around, these areas, whether in Bamiyan or further north, is that you have these areas called, and actually satellite imagery has now shown that there are these places called caravanserais, where pilgrims or travelers would stop into villages, irrespective of religion, cultural identity, ethnic affiliation, and they'd be welcomed into communities as travelers. And now you have, speaking very generally, a much greater sense of insider and outsider, whereas I think before, just the archaeological artifacts would allude to a society that was more integrated.
So, at what point can we specify? At what point did these Buddhas become a target for the Taliban? When or how did the Taliban declare that these things were forbidden and therefore needed to be destroyed?
Yeah, I think you're aware that when the Taliban came about in the early 90s, they had a very specific agenda. Right? It was the creation of an Islamic emirate that was consistent with the laws of Sharia. One of it which stipulates that there can be no art in the form of the image of man, right, as God had created. And so the Buddhas exemplified that. They were not only built in the image of man, but also of an entirely different religion. That belied every tenet of Islam. So in that sense, it was very clear that those things had to be removed or had to be destroyed to be able to create a very consolidated Islamic emirate, right? And to reshape Afghanistan's identity in the meantime. So that, I think, in that sense, that's the agenda that's pretty consistent with what they would have aimed. What I think is more interesting is that whenever they decided that this was an objective, that the Buddhas would be destroyed, it took 25 days to accomplish the act. Right? So the Buddhas weren't destroyed overnight. It took many attempts, huge trucks of dynamite to take them apart, in the view of international media and organizations. So this thing that unfortunately seems to have taken place overnight, and an erasure that seemed to be perhaps unavoidable, may have been largely avoidable given the extent of time that they spent doing it.
So that's really interesting. I mean, a couple of things. This campaign, which lasted weeks, as you say, began at the beginning of March, but it didn't reach its goal until the end of March. All during that period, because the Taliban's intention had been made clear, and the initial attempt to bring the Buddhas down had been publicized. All during that period, there were efforts made internationally, whether through UNESCO or the United Nations or individual countries, efforts made to persuade the Taliban that this was something they should not do. And yet, those very efforts may have reinforced the Taliban's determination to show the world that they were starting anew under their rule, and the rules had changed.
Right. Absolutely. And I think in doing so, not only making a statement about the sort of religious identity of the country that they wanted, but the identity in general, right? So it was almost as if restarting an entirely new chapter in Afghanistan's history, where everything before, like resetting the clock to, before Taliban and after Taliban. And I think that, that created a very important distinction in what the Taliban represented to the Afghan society at that time. The other part to this is, absolutely to your point, is that the UNESCO and other organizations tried to put pressure on the Taliban, but they weren't really recognized as a legitimate government at that time by any other country except for Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. So there was not a lot of political pressure being put on them to, from other countries diplomatically, to disengage from destroying any sort of Afghanistan's cultural artifacts.
It turns out that destroying these Buddhas, as you said, took much more of an effort than they had anticipated. Initially, they brought cannons, they brought tanks, they fired at them, and while they damaged them, they didn't really bring them down. And it took multiple attempts to dig into the Buddhas, put explosives in, essentially blow them up from inside. And even those initial attempts weren't immediately successful. Ultimately, they did, but it's just, it's this awful thing that happens, day after day after day, and must have even frustrated some of them at some point to think that, this was going to be easy, we could get this done. And in fact, it really wasn't that easy.
No, absolutely not. And moreover, they had to co-opt the assistance of the local populations in the valley. So a lot of the Hazara ethnic population that lives there, whom the Taliban also decry as not being, true believers because they're of an entirely different sect, the Shia sect. They were also, they were brought in basically as labor to assist in the destruction of the very things that stood as symbols of their national identity.
Yeah, I read an interview with one of the laborers years later.
Yeah.
He was a local Shia who said he regrets every day and always will the role he was forced to play. I mean, at gunpoint, basically, made to do this. What was the vision that the Taliban had and that they wanted to show through the destruction of the Buddhas? What were they trying to say?
Yeah. I think what they were trying to say is very similar to what I think ISIS was trying to say in places like Palmyra. That one, they were legitimate enough, that they were strong enough to take down something that represented Afghanistan's national identity, or was at least part of Afghanistan's national identity. So they were, one, politically, they were going to reshape Afghan national identity. Two, they would rewrite basically redefine the religious atmosphere that characterized Afghanistan's version of Islam. And mind you, when you look at Afghanistan's history, there is always a tension between forms of the tradition and modernization, and Islam sort of fits into that. But Islam, in a political sense, historically, had mostly been activated for political movements, as in Afghan nationalism, or Afghan independence with the British Empire. But the Afghan national character around Islam was mostly secular, to include in the 1920s, where you had, a king that largely modeled himself on Turkey's Ataturk, right? Trying to create a secular modern society. So, and then you have the golden period in Afghanistan from the 1930s to the 1970s up until the Soviet invasion, where the country was, it was Islamic but mostly secular, and it maintained a balance. With the Taliban coming in, their efforts, characterized by the destruction of the Buddhas, was very much that this, we're no longer standing for this bizarre mix of secular Islam and picking and choosing elements of Sufism to infuse into this interpretation. The interpretation was very strict. It's what's in the Quran, it's what's in the Hadiths, and nothing more. And so that, I think, has become the ultimate rule of, or the ultimate book, like the book of laws and order in Afghanistan, rather than any sort of direction from Afghanistan's cultural history.
Yeah, it's really quite remarkable. I mean, I guess one could overstate the significance of the destruction of the Buddhas because of what would happen 6 months later, which was not an act by the Taliban, but was an act by Al-Qaeda, which was sheltered by the Taliban. So there was a complicity of some kind in simply providing a safe haven for Al-Qaeda to act this way. But I wonder if, are we overstating, do you think, the significance of the destruction of the Buddhas? It seems certainly within the Afghan context, it's an extremely significant act. In the international context, given the attack on the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers there, are we ascribing too much significance in the comparison, or is it, so much driven by this ideology of purification, of insistence on this one way of looking at the world, that it is a harbinger of what would come?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. I don't know that it's a question of overstating it, perhaps, but because they're distinct in many ways. But at the same time, I think that when you where they share a similarity is in the objective. It's in a way of reasserting a new sense of identity, a new sense of power, in the world. And certainly, a way of activating political Islam as a facet of that. But these are organizations, whether Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. You have to also keep in mind that there's tremendous amounts of cooperation between the two, and continues to be among the two. That would certainly if we say that this isn't, that we're overstating one versus the other, it would belie the the similarity and the immediacy of their objectives with regards to what they would like to see happen, whether in the Middle East or in the U.S.
How can you describe for us the relationship at that point, and obviously it's grown since then, between Al-Qaeda, which is essentially an outside force rooting itself in Afghanistan up to 9/11, at the invitation of the government, there's no question, but the relationship between Al-Qaeda and the national indigenous force that the Taliban was and continues to be. They are Afghan.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, and this is the thing. And I think that, at least in the time that I worked in Afghanistan, one of the biggest lessons learned for me was that there were indigenous elements of the Taliban and there were the not so indigenous elements of the Taliban, right? So that you have this, there were, and very much, and there are parts of the Taliban that were not militant at all, right? That there were people that I met in Kandahar who talked about themselves as Talib, but having nothing to do with the ones that were responsible for the death and destruction. But they were students of Islam in that way, and they believed in a certain level of Sharia being more explicitly ordained in the Afghan way of life, right, in politics. So that is one element of it. And then the other part is a more political Taliban, right? And this is where it's, in many ways, it's a label. And so you think of these groups as amorphous, and they can, I'm Taliban one day, I'm Al-Qaeda the next day. It's not really, it's a question of membership. I don't know that, they have like card carrying, here's my Costco card in the same way that I have my, Taliban ID card. So, I think that there's a lot of shifting loyalties among the two, because again, the objective remains the same. And when you're, in many cases, speaking very widely, when you look at groups like that, if you've got a common enemy or common cause, there are moments of cooperation in the same way that many nations who aren't necessarily allies may ally at some point. They work in that same way. With regard to the present circumstances, do they work together? Absolutely. I mean, I think it was just recently that I forget who it was, but somebody from Al-Qaeda was discovered to be in Taliban-controlled Afghan territory.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll talk about the current situation in a bit. I just, it's fascinating to me that, whatever you think about what's happened over the last 20 years, it has been an enormous burden on Afghanistan and an enormous cost to the country and to the people. And yet, as far as I can tell, it doesn't seem like the Taliban have expressed all that much regret for the cost that their relationship with Al-Qaeda imposed on the country itself. Now, in the negotiations, presumably they're going to pledge that no outside actors would mount terrorist threats from inside Afghanistan. Put that aside for the moment. But, that relationship, whatever the upside of that was, and that's a whole question as well, but, the downside seems pretty severe. And I'm wondering if there's, as you said before, there are different strands within the Taliban, so different views may apply to this question. But how do they look at that relationship and what it has done to the country over time by their own choice?
Yeah, and clarify for me for 1 second. Who looks at that relationship? The Taliban.
How does the Taliban see this relationship, and what cost it has imposed on Afghanistan over the years?
Yeah, I think that it's to really answer that question, we have to look at the way that the Taliban would look at Afghanistan, right? Which is a slate that needs to be wiped clean and basically rewritten. And so in that way, I don't necessarily, again, not speaking for the its entire membership in whatever form it may be, is that we have to sort of think the way that they would, perhaps, in that this perhaps reluctant alliance with Al-Qaeda hasn't taken a toll per se, because it's really rectifying a wrong. Right, that Afghanistan was on the wrong trajectory to start with. And by partnering or by teaming with this other entity, they're able to drive it back into the direction of a politically and religiously more moral entity.
So it's just a price you have to pay for
Absolutely.
redirecting it, as severe as that price may be.
Exactly.
I have a question here. I don't know if you would know this, but Andra writes that she was told by a reliable source that the delay in the destruction of the Buddhas was because some of the Taliban workers, those who'd been forced into this, just didn't want to do it, and that Al-Qaeda explosives experts were brought in to finish the job. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That was, I mean, that was an initial cooperation between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda to include, the up until that point, the harboring of Mullah Omar or Osama bin Laden by Mullah Omar into the country just years later.
Yeah. No, it's oof.
Yeah.
Talk about, we here, and it's 20 years. If you're following the war in Afghanistan, I mean, as an American, it's a crazy view of a country to have. Let's just say that.
Indeed.
And we hear about the different ethnic groups and how they're divided, whether by language or by religious practice or by geographic location or political affinities. But if you go back before all of this and you talk about the golden period of Afghanistan, what is the cultural heritage of the diversity of the country? So no doubt there were periods of ups and downs in the relationships among the different groups, but was Afghanistan, for the majority of its history to this point, or to that point into the Soviet, until the Soviet invasion, was it a country where the different groups were at one another's throats, or was it a country that was more marked by coexistence and some measure of getting along with one another?
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent question. And this is, considering my own positionality, given that I was born on a wintry night in 1982, I wouldn't be able to speak to everything that happened prior, in the 1940s and 50s. But having done research in the Afghan diaspora and having worked in Afghanistan, the sense that I'm able to get, and obviously, of course, just from the record, from the historical record, is that just like any country, yeah, there were moments where one group or another group fought together, but in general, most people got along. Right? That that schools were integrated so that you got to see people from other ethnic groups, you got to work with them. In many ways, one of the things that I found more formative of Afghan identity and social stratifications through my own research was a class system, structured almost like a caste system that had nothing really to do with ethnicities or sectarian identities, but everything to do with families and education and prestige and pedigree. So that in and of itself was quite shocking to me, because if you read a lot of the discourse on Afghanistan, you get the sense that it's always the ethnic groups kind of butting heads on each other. But we also have to be cognizant that when those materials are written or when that knowledge is introduced into international society, they're studies made in moments of war and contention. So they speak to a specific point. We have to be cognizant of that. The other aspect that I think is important, and this is what ties into sort of the social memory of any society, is that there was an education system in Afghanistan, even in sort of rural, more remote areas, where people were afforded opportunities to study by the central government, that would put them, that allow them to interface with people from different cultures and backgrounds, and two, that this was taught. That people were aware of what their cultural history was, or were aware that there was Buddhism in Afghanistan, or that there were indigenous Hindu populations in certain provinces. Right? That these things were actually well known. Fast forward to the 21st century, and I don't know that the Afghan curriculum so comprehensively is able to convey the diversity of its own cultural heritage. And no less because of political ideologies.
Yes, I apologize. There's a siren in the background. Perhaps you can hear.
No worries at all.
Life in Brooklyn goes on. That notion of the cultural heritage and the diversity of the cultural heritage as a value. Do you think, in spite of everything over the past 20 years, has that survived to some degree? As the Taliban succeeded in polarizing society to the degree that even that value rooted in some aspect of Afghanistan's history is now questionable, or is there something that remains, do you think, of that value?
I hope, but I think that something does remain. And I think certainly with the younger generation of Afghans, and with certain elements of Afghan civil society, more so than the government, but the civil society, there is a focus, and you see this in the television programming. Some other elements of the media, the focus on reintroducing Afghanistan's cultural heritage as a way of mediating some of the tensions in society. I think those things are a testament to the fact that these things haven't entirely disappeared. However, I do, my main fear at this point is that while those things are still there and they're kind of floundering to survive, it's how international politics may influence their development, right? If they're still sort of nascent, how will a peace settlement with the Taliban affect the development of those things?
Yeah, that's really that's the question now about where these negotiations are going to go and what's going to be sacrificed if the Taliban are going to be a partner in an agreement. I mean, essentially, that's what they would have to be. You spent a number of years in Afghanistan after the war began there, doing a number of aid projects and cultural advising. You left as a little girl, so I won't ask how much you remember, but you're going back there in the context of a war, and a war where, whatever the outcome is, I mean, the U.S. controlled, or U.S. allies controlled, large areas of the country. I mean, what were you expecting when you went back, based on your family's history, what you thought you knew, or even what you remembered, and what you encountered? What was the difference, or were there consistencies in that?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I'm going to have to admit this with a wholehearted sense of embarrassment, that I showed up there with very idealistic notions of, let me, save my people with whom, I have this ethnic affiliation. And especially with women, thinking that they were, that I needed to somehow liberate these ideologies. And so I found that no, it's far more complex, right? And that there isn't this homogenous sense of Afghanness, or a homogenous sense of a struggle, or a homogenous acceptance of what the Taliban represent or what the Afghan central government represented. So in many ways, it was my first encounter with the complexities of Afghanistan's national character. And that to me, happened on different trips where I was, and if I was working on an agriculture project, it was in interactions with farmers, or working on a women's economic income generation project, where I would meet women who were like, okay, got it, I'm fine veiling, but just find a job for my husband or for my son. That's more important. So it was this question of like, what were the national priorities, or what were the individual priorities in villages? Did we really know? Or was this something that was, buzzwords that were designed by foreign aid agencies to sort of resonate with a larger intent? So I think that for me, that was very different. The second element, that was more the professional side. On the personal side, I had lived in Kabul. So I will not speak for what was happening outside. But like I said, it's people that I have interviewed who are from more rural areas can testify to very similar experiences. That, I grew up in Kabul. I grew up in a family that was relatively educated. My grandmother on my mother's side had worked on women's rights issues in Afghanistan. She was one of the pioneer feminists. And, and then on the other side, you had other women who, like my grandmother on my father's side, who had not necessarily finished high school, but was one of the one of the strongest women I knew. And, you had these like very different, but very similar in a way, both Afghan women, but also generations of Afghans that represented tolerance and strength, and just general good humanness. And going back and seeing how war had changed that, where people were really out for themselves, right? The sense of community was gone, or largely it was gone. I wouldn't say that that's how I got treated writ large, but there was something that spoke to the desperation of war that I didn't remember from engagement with Afghans when I was younger.
One of Kelly writes with a question here, and she's asking whether the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas and the issues that women faced caused so many feminist candidates to present themselves for office in 2005. She says there were more women on the ballot in the Bamiyan area than in any other part of Afghanistan. So I don't know if there's a cause and effect there, but the opportunity, if that's the right word, for women to play a public role in the country was certainly a dramatic change from what the Taliban had offered. And in terms of a much more modern, contemporary vision of where women should fit into a society, sort of the presence of the Western forces allowed certain things to happen. Whether that was popular across the board in Afghanistan is a different question. But, what did that opportunity look like, do you think, to Afghan women? And even assuming diversity among those women, so that some women might not have wanted those changes. Some women might have been, willing to accept the way the Taliban saw women and how they should live. But describe the opportunity, that door opening for those women who saw it that way.
Yeah, and Kelly, that's a fantastic question. So, one, I think the opportunity is really a reflection, rather than something that's emergent in Afghanistan's new future. In many ways, it was a reflection of what was available in the past, of which people couldn't avail themselves because of what happened with the civil war and then the onset of the Taliban. So I think, a lot of these women that were incredibly capable and incredibly bright and had the desire and the willingness to be part of Afghanistan's civil society or to work in politics, they had, or in medicine, law, whatever it may have been, they were effectively just, suppressed entirely when the Taliban came in. So all of their talents just put into a box. Whereas prior to that, even after the Soviet invasion, there were still a lot of Afghan women in the public sphere. But certainly after the Civil War and whether it was with people migrating or just not being able to work because of a much segregated society under the Taliban, women had limited contribution. Right? So I think this drive en masse to get back into Afghanistan's public sphere was a testament to Afghanistan's heritage. Right? We're doing something, in many ways, and I'm speaking for them here, which I really can't speak to the collective consciousness of Afghan women, but I think the whole point was, hey, these opportunities are exactly the things that were there, but we lost, and now we're regaining. Right? So these weren't necessarily new.
Let's take a look at the sort of present situation now. There had been negotiations underway in the Trump administration, which did not come to a conclusion, but whose outline seemed to be that the U.S. and other allied forces would ultimately withdraw from Afghanistan based on the commitment of the Taliban towards power sharing and no harboring of Al-Qaeda for outside attacks. The Biden administration is sort of reevaluating its position. But sort of the key element in all of this is, of course, whether the Taliban can be trusted and whether, with the withdrawal of American and other foreign troops, and this is a NATO mission, whether any kind of an agreement is actually going to be worth the paper it's written on. So, where do you see the current standing of these discussions, given, of course, that the Biden administration has not yet made its policy clear on it?
Yeah, and I'll speak very frankly on this part of it. I have as much knowledge about what's happening in terms of this current administration as you guys might. It's what I read in the news and in the conversations that I have. But I think too, in many ways, it's difficult for me to have that sense of confidence in what this new strategy might represent, given an understanding of what the Taliban's objective is writ large. Right? So Yes, they've agreed that Afghan soil won't be used for attacks against the United States, but we also have to keep in consideration, this is just one element of it, is that Afghan soil can be a really interesting concept given Afghanistan's very porous boundaries. So what does that mean? And it's really holding their feet to the fire to say, okay, well, define what you mean by that, because I don't know. I don't have the confidence to think that with the pace that we would like to achieve a settlement, and I'm sure the Afghans would as well, that these questions are going to be interrogated in the same manner. The other aspect of it is that, with regard to U.S. interests, of course, we don't want a repeat of 9/11. But does this deal ensure that? Right? Is this the best deal moving forward? Because if the Taliban are brought in with the understanding that their objective remains the same, then it's going to reconstitute Afghanistan in a political and cultural sense that will be inherently at odds with American values. And is that something, I think this is what, Americans and certainly this new administration has to answer, is that the end state that we want?
It's the question, of course, and William asks, are the Taliban negotiating in good faith? I mean, if, your view seems to be that they have a goal and that's what they're determined to get to. And that goal is a vision of Afghanistan in a certain way, life lived a certain way, which was modeled in the previous years that they were running the country. The negotiations are premised on them having a different kind of goal in mind. So, can they be trusted to negotiate in good faith?
Yeah, and that's it's a fantastic question. I wish I could answer that with a yes or no, rather than like the classic anthropologist. It depends, but it really depends on what we define in good faith. Is it good faith for the Taliban's perspective? Probably. But as an outsider looking in, right, and this is just speaking for myself, I have some clear trust issues with the U.S. Taliban relationship. I don't know that they can necessarily be trusted in the sense that they may not necessarily see themselves as reneging on anything. Right? They're very much moving ahead with their own objectives. So reneging on aspects of the deal with the U.S. to them might just be part and parcel of what they need to achieve a specific objective, and not at all, sort of breaking a bond or breaking their word.
It does raise the question of, if the Afghan government itself is so fragile that it can't stand up by itself against the Taliban, then, are we supposed to sustain it forever becomes the question. So, right. Is there a tipping point that if we stay a certain length of time, and I won't ask you to define that time, but, is it imaginable that somehow this weak central government, which itself internally has factions and differences and tensions and so on, is this something that we could get to the point where the Afghan government itself is strong enough so that even an American withdrawal would not signal its demise?
Yeah, right. And I think, and that's really the crux of it, right? That we have spent so much time, we've invested so much time and resources and lives into this deal. But I also think that we have to be cognizant that this is, the Afghan government may be weak. It certainly is weak, in fact. But I also think that we have to think of this region more largely, right? So the problem in Afghanistan is both an Afghan problem, but it's also regionally dictated. So I think that there's a lot of political pressure or diplomatic pressure being put on Afghanistan, but that might be more useful to do as well with regard to Afghanistan's neighbors, right? That entire South Asian region, right? So that's one element of it. The other part is that I think that there's a lot to be said for Afghanistan's emerging civil society, who are very capable, of coming up with a solution. But I do think that, and given more time, I do think that the Afghan government could, is standing up on its own feet, but I think it's being undermined in many ways by both regional politics and then, well-intentioned international efforts to try to negotiate a peace settlement with this entity that has basically just bided its time for power. But I think the Afghans can manage as long as some of the regional elements are tempered in this ongoing negotiation.
Mm-hmm. Now, you are a member of the Afghan American community, and again, we can't say that a community of that size has one view of anything. But what are the currents within that community, as you understand it, when they look at Afghanistan? And I'm sure it's generational as well. But what expectations or hopes do Afghans in America have for what's going on in the country? Do they feel like it's salvageable? Have people thrown up their hands and said, I'm sorry, there's just nothing really to do to save this? What is the mood within the Afghan American community as it contemplates, all of this long struggle?
Yeah, I think it's one of, you have a diminishing sense of hope, you have an enlarging sense of resignation. And that resignation really comes from not looking into Afghanistan, but looking at the lack of attention given to the diaspora in Afghanistan's reconstruction. And I say that with a grain of salt, because I think, you've got Zalmay Khalilzad, who's in Afghanistan, who's part of the Afghan diaspora, right? He's in the US, and now he's the US envoy for negotiations with the Taliban. But at the same time, when you look at the amount of money that the US has spent, speaking very cynically, in Afghanistan, we could have saved a lot of money by using the diaspora as a resource. So you had an entire group of people spread between, between both coasts that were willing and able to go overseas as more of a concerted effort to go to Afghanistan to help train up things like customs and border protection, or not protection, but customs and borders, what is it called? Their training efforts or their advisory efforts, or anything else, the Ministry of the Economy or Ministry of Defense. There were people here that had that institutional knowledge. Now, they were hired en masse for contracting opportunities that were for a few years here and there, and were certainly lucrative, but it didn't, you had people that were doctors and lawyers who were translators for a year or two, and then there was no other way that they could apply their skills to Afghanistan's reconstruction. So in many ways, you have had a diaspora that could have been really useful to Afghanistan's reconstruction, and probably in many ways limited the cost of the investment that the US has made in the country, but none of that has happened. So both the diaspora has been voiceless in many ways, and the Afghans have been voiceless in many ways, and then you just have sort of these policymakers that don't necessarily have the view into the inner workings of Afghan society or its social memory, and the various militant groups with whom they're engaging. And they're really driving the agenda.
So what's an agenda for a restored Afghanistan, if that's the right word? And I'd like to round that back to the Buddhas and the larger question of cultural heritage. So the destruction of the Buddhas was clearly a mark of what the Taliban's view of the world is. And they're essentially saying, we really don't care about general heritage. All we care about is our vision of the world. Assuming for the moment that it's not rooted there, and Afghanistan, given the diversity of its history and given the Silk Road and everything else that has wrapped Afghanistan into much larger historical and cultural narratives in the region, where do you see the role of culture going forward for Afghanistan?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think so. If we're realistic, it seems as though the Taliban will be some part of Afghan society moving forward. But I think that there should be a specific acknowledgement that Afghanistan's cultural, both material artifacts and sort of its non-material ideologies have to remain intact. And so moving forward, I think with if there's a semblance of peace, so if the ceasefires actually happens and a semblance of governance is able to be maintained, then I think a much needed emphasis on cultural education needs to happen in Afghan society. And this isn't sort of the frou-frou, cultural peace building stuff. It's the stuff of real conflict prevention. It's one thing to see cultural artifacts get destroyed and have the reactive reaction of, oh my goodness, how can this happen? Or you can have the proactive approach of how do you prevent something like this from happening? How do you prevent the erasure of someone's social memory and national identity? And those things are dialogues that the US can help engage in Afghanistan more proactively, before the country's lost to yet another extremist organization. Because again, think about these generations that are growing up, and all they will know is what happened post the Taliban period. And that can be done through both just education curriculum, that can be done through museums that are established, through the media content in Afghan society, if the media is allowed to function in a way that's open and transparent and nonpartisan. But if it's not, then I would fear for what Afghanistan's identity or national identity might look like in a few years.
You've written a lot about identity in Afghanistan and the connection between national identity and nation building, which of course is a big topic. And clearly, if you're going to destroy the Buddhas, you're destroying something about a nation's identity in terms of its openness or willing to recognize the diversity of its own history. You talked about curriculum and that sort of thing, but do you think there is an appreciation within the government circles that, one of the battles with the Taliban is exactly over this notion of identity, how it's defined, and what it's rooted in terms of not just attitudes, but also cultural property itself?
That's a good question. So is there a larger, I think so. I think that you've got, think about it. Afghanistan's current president is an anthropologist. So there's surely a cultural anthropologist, no less. So I think that there is an appreciation for the impact that heritage and legacy and history have on the social and political evolution, of any country. But in Afghanistan in particular, yeah, I think so. There have been, if you look at certain artifacts like the Bactrian gold, so this like golden hoard that a Russian archaeologist, Viktor Sarianidi, found in northern Afghanistan, in Tel Tepe. Those things where people protected it with their lives. Like there was an understanding that this thing that is not Islamic, may not have even necessarily been part of, Afghanistan as Afghanistan was formed in, between 1747 and 1757, that it was outside of that period even. But realizing that this is a part of Afghan national heritage, it was in the Afghan museum, that people protected that treasure with their lives. That there is a sense that these things represent what Afghanistan is and who Afghans are. And so I think, does that translate so that those are, civilians, but does that translate to the government? I think so. I think so, but I think that it becomes diluted by, political settlements like this that undermine those sorts of efforts, which is ironic because I think that, the very people that might undermine those sorts of things, especially coming from U.S. foreign policy community, should be more cognizant of their effects in American society. Right? We are, as Americans, we are so unbelievably fortunate that we can have these tense national debates about what to do about Confederate monuments, right? That we have the Confederate monuments, that there can be a debate around it, that there can be consensus in some places. Right? That's really a privilege. And I hope that sort of a privilege is afforded to Afghanistan and the Afghans.
I wonder if, looking back, this 20-year period of an Afghan government under the guidance or the tutelage or whatever word you want to use of Western powers, nonetheless, a whole generation has been educated differently. A generation of young women has been in school, be able to pursue their ambitions to the degree that that's possible, not in the face of some kind of government-imposed limits on that. some of the groups have been forced to cooperate, whether they wanted to or not, in terms of building a government and building, social and civic institutions. Is that, in your view, something that has taken on stability, or is that something that is also entirely vulnerable to what the Taliban might bring if they came back into power? Is it really imaginable in the Afghan context that young women would get no education past third grade or whatever it was, or has that rooted itself to a different degree now?
That's a good question, and to be honest with you, I'm not quite sure, and it's a question that I ponder a lot. But so one, I think that we can get an answer, right? That there can be a degree of transparency that is either not manifest through these dialogues with the Taliban, or maybe it's known to people and it's just not necessarily communicated to the public. I don't know. I don't know where our current administration stands on that. I think there may be an argument, not up until the third grade, but I think that there is an argument that can be made by the Taliban if they were put into power, that it would become incredibly difficult for women to get education past a certain point. And this could be in the closure of schools. Whether that's palatable to Afghan society, I don't think so. But then that also goes back to the fact that then there's not going to be a ceasefire because people are going to push back and fight against, imposing such strict laws on people's rights, right? Especially when people have been more used to, more modern or Western ideas of education and human rights.
If we sum up, what are the last 20 years and then the 10 years before that, the last 30 years of war and conflict? That has to leave a terrible mark on a country. But, if you look at the balance of what that has done to Afghanistan, what are the things that you find most powerful as markers of the legacy of this heritage in Afghanistan? And is there something in that mix that gives you some hope about the Afghans being able to move forward in a positive way?
That's a wonderful question. So, as somebody that teaches a class on Afghanistan's political history, I think one of the things that I've come to recognize and appreciate about Afghanistan is that it seems to exist on this ever-widening pendulum between, progress and destruction in many ways, and this incredible resilience to go from nothing to something. And so I wonder if this 30-year period is just another hard swing of the pendulum, where we're now in this one, we're in the crux, and that moving forward, Afghanistan will start to rebuild back to what it used to be, not even to what it used to be, but to a better version of itself. I do remain hopeful of that. I just think that there's that the Afghan people themselves cannot be undermined in the process. Right? It is a question of voice and representation that has to occur at a local level.
Well, it's a wonderful thought, and I hope it is something that can be realized. I want to thank Marwari Zafar for taking the time speaking with us today. I do want to make my pitch. I've come around to doing this with some regularity. For those of you who may not be members or regulars to these programs, they are offered to the world at large, and we hope you will continue to come to these programs and tell your friends about them. But if you are inclined to think about supporting us by becoming a member of the museum or otherwise, we would greatly appreciate it. All cultural institutions, our own included, are facing difficult moments during the COVID crisis, and your support for this programming would be most welcome. On that, I want to thank Marwari Zafar again. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I'm Clifford Shannon on behalf of the 9/11 Memorial Museum. We will see you next time.